Welcome to Old Path in our study through the Old Testament. We are currently going through the book of 2 Chronicles, and we make it to chapter 26 and then the very brief chapter of 27. What we'll do is we'll leave chapter 28 till next week because it really takes us from this bit of the kings, or these few kings, and it brings us to the person of Hezekiah, the king Hezekiah. And really that whole history from him going forward to me is really kind of an interesting portion of the history for a number of reasons, but he's very notable because he's there at the time in Judah when Assyria comes during the ministry of Uzziah. And so it's kind of a part of the history of the kings that becomes very familiar because of some of the other people involved. And so I want to leave that to its own. It'll be the last king before we get to Hezekiah, and then moving from Hezekiah and his whole story through the end of the kings. Very, very interesting what we have remaining in the book. So I want to deal with chapter 26 and 27 today, where we're going to be introduced to a new king that comes up. And I just want to make sure when we're looking at the passages in 2 Kings that talk about the same part of the history, the difference that you have there is he's referred to as Azariah. In 2 Kings, he's called Uzziah here. And interestingly enough, there's very little detail that we get about him when you read through 2 Kings, but there's a lot that is told to us about him here in Chronicles. So we're going to get to that. Again, it's chapter 26 and 27. And as we kind of move our way through the last of the kings here, once again, I'm struck by this. I'm sure that you probably are as well. But this really does help us kind of understand when it comes to this whole matter of parenting and how is it that kids can be so radically different from their parents. It is a pretty fascinating thing because you see these kings, some of them are so good and their kids are so bad, and sometimes the kids turn out to be so much better than the parents. And so it's such an odd thing, but it does tell us and it helps us to understand that each person does have to stand before God on their own merits and what they believe and how much they trust him and how much they believe in who he is and what he commands of us. Will go a long ways to decide whether or not that's going to be a faithful person. In fact, that's really the only criteria. Is if a person is faithful to the Lord, their lives are going to reflect it. And then just how seriously they take what God requires of us, let me say it a different way, how seriously any of us takes who he is, what he requires of us, and how it is that we can walk rightly before him. How serious a person takes that is going to go a long ways to determine how it is that their lives are going to reflect that, whether or not they will have God's assistance in those times. And it's really a fascinating part of the history, going through the kings, to see how an entire nation can be brought down or can be lifted up because of the actions of a king. And in some cases, as we'll see here in these next few weeks, what happens among the people is a lot of times is a reflection of the king, and yet even a good king cannot always get the people behind him. And so it's just kind of human nature because people are going to do what they're going to do. So this Uzziah, interesting character. Once again, when you compare the parallels to this in 2 Kings, his life and what we know of him is quite brief from 2 Kings. What we have is quite a bit more here in Chronicles, though he reigned for a very, very long time, among the longest of any of the kings of either Israel or Judah, and yet there's not a lot said about him. But we'll just take what we see here in 2 Chronicles. So chapter 26 is where we are today, at least where we'll begin. We'll take care of chapters 26 and 27. So let's have a word of prayer. Father, as we come to you, we pray that you would help us in our understanding of your word and that you would bless the time that we have with you. We pray, Lord, that you would give us ears to hear what we might glean from this as we read these parts of history. May we not just be people who read history, but we might make proper application to what we read. And Lord, we pray that you would be glorified as we take this time to study your word and that you would grow us in our understanding and our faith in you. And we give you thanks and praise in Jesus' name. All right, chapter 26. Remember I had mentioned about his name being a little different. There's also some little bit of intrigue what we saw in the close of last chapter is that his father had gone to Lachish, and they ultimately killed him there. There are some who believe that what had happened is he had gone away from Jerusalem, ran off to Lachish, and may have been there for a while, and in his time out from Jerusalem, that they had made Uzziah also the king. There are some reasons why there is that belief, but there is definitely a time where it shows that Uzziah was in this place and he was put there instead of, and that gives the impression it's not just because Azariah died, but while he was still alive, kind of outcast, that Uzziah came into this position. We get that from verse 2 here. So in verse 1 of 26, now all the people of Judah took Uzziah, who was 16 years old when they made him king, instead of his father Amaziah. I'm sorry, I said that was in verse 2. In verse 1 here, we get that they made him instead of his father. So it would be a natural progression that he would become the king after. Now, there is also speculation that is Uzziah genuinely really the firstborn, and maybe that might be why it says instead of Amaziah, in that he died and then that's when Uzziah was made king. So depending on who you ask, different scholars have a different view of this, and so I know I threw a lot of stuff out there at once. The two basic thoughts are that Uzziah may not have been the natural successor, and so he was made by the people, the person that would take the place for his deceased father. Other option, the deceased father went to Lachish, and while he was in Lachish, they made Uzziah the king in Jerusalem, and then later went on to kill the father for his wickedness and treachery. So it genuinely doesn't really change anything as far as the narrative is concerned. This is the king who took over after, whatever overlap there may have been. As far as the kings are concerned, there was Amaziah, and then there was Uzziah, his son, one of his sons. So verse 2 says, now he built Elath and restored it to Judah after the king rested with his fathers. So we know from previous that this is what his father had begun, and Elath, as it's referred to here, it's now modern day referred to as Elat, and that's at the very tip of where Israel comes and meets the Red Sea. And it's kind of a thriving area now. We visited it once, and on one of our trips to Israel, and it's a pretty amazing place, but it's a port city, and so it would have great importance for trade coming up through the Red Sea into that very tip portion of Israel, and then being taken north into where civilization is. But really, even to this day, if you stop pretty much at Beersheba, or over to the west of it, or to the east of it rather, even to the bottom of the Dead Sea, all the way down to that tip of the country, there's not a lot that goes on there. It's a pretty barren place. So this is a port city. He builds it up. Uzziah, it tells us in verse 3, was 16 years old when he became the king. He reigned for 52 years. So that tells you how long his time as being a king was. And when you go back and you look at 2 Kings 14, verse 21 and 22 has a couple little brief mentions of him, and then he's brought back up in chapter 15, verse 4. So not much is said about him, but he reigned for 52 years. That's a very long time to be a king. So it says his mother's name was Jecholiah of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. So remember, even with Amaziah, there were times that he did things that seemed right, and then we know the things that he did that were just so off the wall. And it really is kind of the history of so many of the kings. They're kind of all built the same way. It's an odd thing to behold. So in verse 4, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. He sought God all the days of Zechariah, who had understood in the visions of God. He had understanding in the visions of God, and as long as he sought the Lord, God made him prosper. Now, I want to take a moment here. I'm going to put up once again this list of the good kings and the bad kings and where they were, because, again, it'll help us as we go through the rest of this particular part of the book. Now, verse 6 tells us, now he went out and he made war against the Philistines, and he broke down the wall of Gath, the wall of Jabeh, and the wall of Ashdod, and he built cities around Ashdod and among the Philistines. So the first of his things, again, we're going to see some of his, I guess you could call his military exploits. And so the Philistines occupied the territory along the Mediterranean from what we call modern day the Gaza Strip, which has been, contested, once belonged to or was part of what was Egypt, even though it encroaches into, the ancestral territory of Israel. But all along the coast is where the Philistines were. So you could go back and look at where those cities were. They're all along the Mediterranean and a little bit inland. And so this was him. Judah would be the first place that they would come after as far as the territories were concerned, and Jerusalem was, of course, a big part of that. But this is his way of fortifying the cities that would be in that direction, which would put a buffer of fortified cities where, of course, there would be stationed and where he would have his men of war kind of keeping an eye on it. So think about this. The belligerence of the Philistines all the way back to Saul and David's time continues these hundreds of years later with these kings, that the opposition that you had of those groups of the Philistines has been going on for such a long time, all the way back into the time of the judges. So it's been going on for hundreds of years, and this is now a new king comes in. He starts to build these fortified cities. Verse 7. This is an interesting passage. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians who lived in Gur Baal, and against the Maonites. Now, there are groups that are there that are mentioned, and even this Gur Baal, that are really kind of left for people to try to figure out. We don't know for absolutely sure. But what we have here is, once again, as he's having this problem out on his west coast with the Philistines, now he's having the problem out here on the eastern border of kind of his territory, and even on the other side of what we would call, or what we know as, the Dead Sea. But this is all that area. Now, where exactly all these places were and who exactly these people are that are mentioned here is kind of, it's left up to some interpretation and some archaeological, what their best kind of guesses are. To the people reading Chronicles, it would have made a lot more sense. It's kind of lost to us as far as the history, but the idea that God helped him against these groups. So that help is always going to be, well, I shouldn't say always, but potentially going to be a few different things. Does he give them help in the assistance of fighting the battles? Does he give them help in the way of giving him insight, tipping him off to things that may be happening, or helping him in the way of knowing how to go after them? We don't get a lot of details on what these skirmishes were, but the idea that he built fortifications, that help would be anything from raw materials to people to insight and all of the above. It seems like he was very, very highly favored, and we're going to see that at the end of his time that really kind of worked against him. But I don't want to get too far ahead of us, because it really is an interesting kind of case study. But God helped him in these matters, and it gives the impression also, without God's help, these things wouldn't have happened maybe at all, or if they did, certainly in no ways as effectively as they should have. So also, the Ammonites, they brought tribute to Uzziah. His fame spread as far as the entrance to Egypt, for he became exceedingly strong. So this gives also some kind of a glimpse into him going at the Ammonites on this, because they should have been bringing this tribute, and we find out that when he finally brought it to where it's supposed to be, that they brought this tribute in an ongoing way over and above what was supposed to have been the agreement. We'll see that in a little bit. Uzziah built the tower of Jerusalem at the corner gate, and at the valley gate, and at the corner buttress of the wall. Then he fortified them. So these are fortifications that took place in the place of Jerusalem. Once again, these are the actions of a man who genuinely understands the world in which he lives, and it was heavily fortified against all of the people who look to do harm to the nation. He realizes that though God has given him incredible favor to the point where they're subdued enough that they're not threatening him, but he still makes sure that he fortifies these things, just wisdom of knowing the places where you live. It says he also built towers in the desert. These are places of observation, knowing if trouble is coming. He dug many wells, for he had much livestock, both in the lowlands and in the plains, and he also had farmers and vine dressers in the mountains at Carmel, for he loved the soil. That was such a fertile area. Now, Carmel from Jerusalem is quite a trek when you stop to think of it. It's well up into the north and up along the kind of the west coast of the Mediterranean. So Carmel looks over, from your perspective, it looks over the whole Jezreel Valley, or some people call it the Valley of Armageddon, and it runs the length, that whole valley runs the length of Israel up in the north. So that shows that he's got reach well beyond the tribes of Judah. That would all be part of the tribes that belonged to the northern kings. So really interesting. It just tells you how far his reach had gone. And once again, even with all this information, this seems like a particular king that has incredibly prospered under God's hand, and yet history just doesn't record an awful lot about him. Now, we do know that in his time, and towards the latter part of his life, this is when Isaiah is coming onto the scene. And there are a number of the prophets that we're starting to see, of the major and the minor prophets, starting to come onto the scene, some in the north and some in the south. And there's kind of a bit of an overlap here. So Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem, the corner gate. He also made towers out in the desert, verse 10, dug wells, and all the way up into the Carmel he had dealings. So verse 11, moreover, Uzziah had an army of fighting men who went out to war by companies according to the number of their roll, as prepared by Jael the scribe and Messiah the officer, under the hand of Hananiah, one of the king's captains. And so the total number of the chief officers of the mighty men of valor was 2,600. So these people that were over, this is basically just saying it's over the families of the tribe of Judah. And so these would be the people who oversaw the army itself, and we get the number of that because under their authority was an army of 307,500 who made war with mighty power to help the king against the enemy. So though God gives him, and it says God helps him, this is also one of the ways that God helped, in that he made the nation prosper and gave them plenty of people who were able to do and to execute war if that was the case. And that does tend to keep some of the bad guys at arm's length, especially if the king is walking rightly before the Lord. If they're ever called upon to go to battle, we know this from their history. God doesn't always, I guess you could say this is pretty frequent. God will oftentimes fight an entire battle without them having to lift a sword. He did so during Jehoshaphat's reign. And so if the people and the king are walking rightly before God and they are in a place of right standing with him, there's really no war that they would have to engage in which they didn't already know the outcome to begin with. That's just a given. And that's, again, why it's so amazing to me how it is that the kings get this so wrong so often. So it goes on, and so Uzziah prepared for them for the entire army, shields and spears, helmets, body armor, bows and slings, and so that they could cast stones. He also made devices in Jerusalem invented by skilled men to be on the towers and the corners, and to shoot arrows and large stones, so that his fame spread far and wide, for he was marvelously helped until he became strong. So even the invention of things, this is like now modern type of warfare things. Well, I shouldn't say modern as in our times, but there is a whole new type of weaponry that started to come onto the scene. Some people would look at this and say this is like catapults that are being referred to, and ways of using things that were kind of known to them. The idea of being able to hurl stones with slings, but doing it in a much larger scale, is a whole new kind of weaponry. So what we have here is just kind of, without much detail, something that was different and prepared for warfare like hadn't been seen quite the same way in this part of the world. So that's what seems to be discussed here, though we don't have any direct, we can point to it and know what this is, but machinery that was starting to be scaled up to anything that they had had before in the order of making war. So, verse 16 says, "But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God by entering the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense." That is an amazing thing. So, it tells us that God was really kind of heavily involved in the entirety of their lives and in the day-to-day of the king's ascendancy and what he was able to get accomplished. But then it got to the point where he became so powerful and so successful that he started to step outside of what his given role was. So what he wants to do at this point, and even if his motivations were totally pure, he's so thankful to God. He wants to go burn incense. He wants to do something that is his ministry and wants to take this before the Lord. No matter what his motivations are, one thing that we know as far as the tribes are concerned and what their function was, it was absolutely forbidden from him to be able to do this. Now, again, remember, this is in the line of David, a king of Judah. So he's of the tribe of Judah. What he wants to do is something that God says that is absolutely the purview of the tribe of Levi, and most importantly, of a direct descendant of Aaron. The priests were to do that, and they alone. And so they were the ones who could go in and do this. God designed it this way. So here's a king, probably because he's had so much success, not really understanding fully that it's God who has given him that, and the last one whom he would want to offend would be the God who has given him such success. And yet, he becomes at this point so, I guess you could even say, filled with himself, that he takes upon himself to do something he has no business doing. And it's not going to be something that God looks the other way on. That's the important point to understand as well. So, verse 17, "So Azariah, the priest, went up after him, and with him 80 priests of the Lord." These were valiant men. So we think of these priests as warriors as well. And so these guys are, think about this. Here is where the priesthood is having to withstand the king, and they're doing so even in force. This is no small matter, but it also helps the priests to understand their role and their responsibility in this matter. There are times that we know in their history when the priests may not have even cared about such things because they were so unbelievably corrupt. In this case, he is the king. Uzziah has so radically overstepped his position that the only thing for them to do without the defilement entirely and bringing the wrath upon the whole nation is for them to stop and prevent the king from doing this thing. It's a big deal. So, verse 18, "So they withstood King Uzziah. They said to him, 'It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the son of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have trespassed, and you will have no honor from the Lord your God.'" Now, that's at this point, from what we can see here, it gives the impression that had Uzziah relented and just stopped at that point and said, "You're right. I'm completely out of where I should be. I'm going to go back away from here. And, thanks for the warning. I don't know what I was thinking." And he could take that before the Lord and should have done exactly that. Because there is nothing in their challenge to him that is in any way inaccurate. All of it is precisely what is supposed to be done. According to the law, he has no business being in there. But that's not how he handles it. Uzziah became, verse 19, he became furious, and he had the censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priests, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of the Lord beside the incense altar. This is a great way of God making a big issue of this. He could have struck him dead, could have done any number of things, but the idea that he would make him a leprous man is something that absolutely separates you from the commonwealth of the people. Leprosy was something that was quarantined, and you are cast out at that point. And that happening to a king is no small matter. That it happened in front of the priests is that much more important, and bigger than all of it is the reason for it. it was an immediate way of them recognizing God is judged in this matter. And this would have been a very big deal to see a king in exile and basically outside of the camp and outside of the city where he could be a part of everything in the day-to-day of things, to go from being the king to a man who is a leper and an outcast, all because of one thing and his unwillingness to accept what God had called him to do. It again makes you wonder, how is being the king of Judah not enough for you? A descendant of David sitting on a throne that God has promised would be a forever kingdom. And so that somehow is not enough. But again, this is part of the problem, I think, that happens in its human nature, and the applications are myriad to this. A person who can have so much success, and they can have so many things at their fingertips, and somehow it's never enough, and they take on to themselves something that they have no business taking on. This is what happens to him, and you see the results of it. So, Azariah, the chief priest, and all the priests looked at him, and there on his forehead was the leprosy. And so they thrust him out of the place, and they also hurried to get him out because the Lord had struck him. King Uzziah was a leper until the day of his death. He dwelt in an isolated house because he was a leper, for he was cast off from the house of the Lord. And then Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. And so once again, a kind of an overlap during that time. Now we're going to find what his son is like. But this is it raises an interesting question. When it comes to the idea, could he not have been healed of the leprosy? Clearly, obviously, yes. We know that when we see what it takes to not only be cleansed of the leprosy, but to be restored to the normal place, a number of things have to take place. First of all, the man has to be healed. Then he would have to present himself to the priests, and there was a whole protocol to it. And once they would be able to observe that it was indeed healed, they then could reestablish him and let him back into his normal place. The priests were never the ones who healed. Sometimes the prophets would do so. There would be various ways where God would heal something, but it was the priest to whom they had to show themselves to be put back into normal, if you will, kind of circulation among the people. But it wasn't the priests who were doing the healing. It was God who would do the healing. And again, through a different means. That never took place in Uzziah's life. We have no idea whether he even asked it, or whether by the time that it all happened, had he just become so kind of out of his mind in who he was and what he was supposed to do that he never even asked, or if he asked, did God not do it because the offense was so great? Hard to say. But it is an interesting question nonetheless. Wouldn't it be great to know for sure? So it tells us he was a leper until the day he died, and the rest of his acts, verse 22, from the first to the last, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, wrote. And so Uzziah rested with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of burial, which is outside, or which belonged to the kings. For they said, he is a leper. And then Jotham, his son, reigned in his place. So once again, we'll take a look at the kings in this place, and we'll find out that, or if you go back, you can take a screenshot of what I shared earlier, just rewind it, or send me an email, and I can send you the actual file that I have of the kings. It's just a picture. It's a JPEG file. So with that being said, his son takes over in his place, though they were kind of, you could almost call it co-regent. We don't know for sure really a whole lot about what either one of them did in that interval of time. But what a shame it is that a man would go from that place of just incredible prominence and that place of such favor before the Lord into this place of exile. And really, ultimately, what a shame it is to watch what becomes of his son, because we find out that his son is just not a good guy. So this chapter here is very, very brief. It tells us Jotham was 25 years old when he became the king. He reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah had done, although he did not enter the temple of the Lord, but still the people acted corruptly. Now, I think I misspoke a moment ago. about his son and what he was like. This is not the troubled son. This one comes after is. So what we see here, though, is, again, he did like what his father did. It says here, interestingly enough, he didn't fall into the same folly as his father did. And the example is given that he had gone into the place into the temple to try to offer sacrifice or incense. That would just be kind of more the symptom of the problem. I think what's more important here, he didn't fall into the same folly as his father of going outside of what God had designed him to do. So we see he was 25 years old, and he when he became the king, and he reigned for 16 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jerusha. So it says in verse 3, so he built the upper gate of the house of the Lord, and he built extensively at the wall of Ophel. That we believe is pretty much northern part of the city, and kind of out towards the Damascus gate, out that way, the northern part of the city. But again, there's disagreement on where exactly that is. So it says, moreover, he built cities and mountains in Judah, and in the forest he built fortresses, and he also built towers. He also fought with the king of the Ammonites, and he defeated them, and the people of Ammon gave to him in that year 100 talents of silver, 10,000 cores of wheat, and 10,000 of barley, and the people of Ammon paid this to him in the second and the third years also. So mentioning this from the beginning of the last chapter, this is something that should have been being done, but it continued for another 2 years as a way of saying, this is what you should have been doing all along. You didn't, and he got it for 3 years. But this is the important part that you see about him. So Jotham became mighty. Why? Because he prepared his ways before the Lord his God. That is a whole study all in and of itself, and I think it's instructive. I think that this should be said of every single person, because this is the attitude of heart. This is what you see in the greatest of all of the kings. This is said of Jehoshaphat, it's said of David, and it's said of just select few of the men. But what this means to us and how we would want to make application to it. How does this work exactly? What does it look like when it's done? This is a person, if you wanted to know, we may know him, and hopefully you're one of these yourself, that when it comes to your decisions and the way that you conduct yourself and how you do the things that you do in your own life, how much of that is really dictated by your walk with the Lord, or your desire to be pleasing to him? How do you know if you're in that place? You basically know it because you allow God to have a place in your life where you're sensitive to the things that he wants. That means you take time to know his will by what his word has to say. This is how you spend your time as far as your fellowship is concerned. This is, goes to matters of prayer. It goes to everything that is essential to the walk of the believer. Read again how it said that he became mighty, and there was a reason for his might, because he prepared his ways before the Lord. So again, that means if you're a king in this case, this almost goes back and sounds a little bit like what Solomon would have done. I don't know how to lead the people out or bring them back in. Basically him saying, I'm not my father. I don't know how to do these things. And so his desire was, God, show me the way. What must I do? How can I do this? Will you give me wisdom and understanding? That's the kind of heart that must be present in order for this to be said of a person. And in this case, a king. It should be said of us, and this is how we should conduct ourselves. So for us, as we hear this and we read this, when we see a particular king or a person historically, as we read about them, but we see something that is so right and done so well, it's good for us to say, what does that look like, and how can I reproduce that kind of thing? How could that be said of me? So that idea of preparation, I want to make sure that as God has laid hold of me in my life, how may I be pleasing to him in what he's called me to do? That's his reason for his success. That's why he is successful. Verse 7. So then it says of him, now the rest of the acts of Jotham and his wars and his ways, indeed are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And he was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 16 years at Jerusalem. And so he rested with his fathers, and they buried him in the city of David. Then Ahaz, his son, reigned in his place. So Ahaz is going to be this next of the kings. He goes from that being wicked. So from the kings that he had there as an example, a king who was very, very mighty, had 50 plus years where he was the king in Judah, and did many, many great things, and God really prospered him in unimaginable ways to our minds. Then along comes his son for another 16 years, doing the same kind of things. God has his hand on him. And what you have as an example in your father is one who set his heart to be prepared before the Lord. He desired to do what God wanted him to do. And then along comes his son. It is the debauchery and the sickness of Ahaz is legendary. It's incredible, and you'll see how it's written there. But he gives way to Hezekiah, who is very much like the grandfather and the great-grandfather. So this, how it jumps a generation and sometimes more, and sometimes it works in both ways, is nothing short of amazing. But it really does help us to understand. You may have great parents. You may have horrible parents. You can't blame them, and you can't necessarily, even if you give them credit for how it is that they raised you, if you had those kind of parents, at the end of the day, you still have to be the one who walks rightly before the Lord. You can't depend on them. You have to walk on your own, and God's going to examine each person based on their own walk with him. So it's just such an interesting history, and it's really kind of an interesting study in what human nature is like. You can have people with every conceivable benefit, and they turn out to be just horrendous people. Ahaz was one of those guys. You can also have people who grew up in the worst of circumstances, and yet they turn out to be stellar, amazing people. And if it's in a spiritual sense, this is again that kind of matter. If a person's heart will be right before the Lord, he will lead them and bring them to great things. So interesting study through the life of the kings. We're going to pick up, I intentionally, I know it's a bit of a shorter study today, but the next chapter is really very interesting because it, again, brings us to the person of Hezekiah. And if you think about it, you have Hezekiah, Manasseh, Josiah, and then the sons of Josiah who are just the worst. And then the nation itself goes into the Babylonian captivity. So that's what we have left ahead of us in the book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. It's, again, a fascinating part of Israel's history, and it is something that we should become very, very familiar with because there's so much that can be learned on the application side of it. So for people that say that it's not necessary, it's not important that we would be studying the Old Testament, I think you only need to go through the kings and the prophets to realize just how important it is to know this history, because it tells us so much about God's nature and how does he deal with his covenant people. How is he when it comes to matters of sin? What does he do in his opposition to those who would rebel against him? What does he do in those people who come to him with the right and a clean heart? Those are all questions that we would be talking about through the church. So these are very important matters, and knowing how God does what he does is massively important. Knowing that he communicates to his people, knowing that he has given us a written record of those things, all of it is hugely important, and it's good to know those things from a historical perspective. So we'll pick up at chapter 28 next week, and until then, read ahead, and I pray that God really does prosper and bless your study through his word.